tonight, our topic is parking, with so many things happening around parking in our community. The change from COVID, with all the parklets, with all the changes that are happening on Choro Street, that have happened on Marsh Street, communities in an uproar. You've all heard all the things, right? Parking is a hot topic within our town. I sent a note out to the architects in town and to say, hey, please come to this little event and let's talk about parking. And one of my colleagues wrote back, I'm not going to say his name. He said, he wrote me back a note this morning, and so I thought it was timely. I thought I'd read it for you. It said, currently traveling in Europe, and so I won't be able to participate. I'll paraphrase. He says, but being a seasoned traveler like yourself, you understand that traffic and parking in major European cities such as Paris, Milan, is an absolute free-for-all nightmare. Without question, every single person, cab, Uber driver, etc., had no problem expressing their frustration at the insanely frenetic traffic in their cities, usually without us even asking. The cabbies blame the bicyclists blame the cars. That sounds familiar. And everyone blames the politics. Say love me. He said, that said, the only EU city we visited that obviously seemed to have their traffic and parking under control is Copenhagen. The bike-to-car ratio is unbelievable. Probably the only city on the planet where more per capita bicycles than cell phones. And I thought that was an interesting way to think about that. More bicycles than cell phones. And then he goes on. I wanted to stop at just that point. What we need to do when we think about parking is start thinking about it in terms of different, in my opinion, different types of measurement. How do we think about parking? Is it cars per area of shop? Is it cars per person? Is it parking spaces for these giant things? I don't know. I'm hoping that we get some answers tonight, or at least we get some thoughts tonight on what we can do, okay? And so that's why we've got Chad here tonight. We also want to thank our sponsor, the City of San Rafael, Obispo, Derek, and his team. Derek, thank you for supporting us. Hotel SLO has been great to us. SLO Provisions, USGBC, Four Creeks, Will, I didn't mention Will, Ruoff, Four Creeks, myself, Jim, Andy, we're kind of the primary sponsors of this event, and we need help. Okay, I was told, don't ask for money, Greg, but I'm going to tell you, I'm going to do it anyway. This is a soft ask. To do an event like this, to get people here, it's important to our community. Please come and talk to us after the event if you think you might want to help out with this project. This has really been fun. And here's our upcoming events. So we're trying to tackle a whole bunch of really fun things. Our public art resilient communities, we've got people lined up. We're excited to do these. Okay?
Charge more for tickets.
We'll get tickets. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce Chad Lynn. He's going to tell you all about himself. Let's give him a big welcome. Thank you.
So real quickly, I just want to do kind of a sound check. I'm going to try not to use the mic, but I want to make sure you can hear me. All right, excellent. I have a very loud, this is my quiet inside voice. So I want to thank everybody for coming. I mean, the opportunity to talk about parking is truly one of my passions in life. Throughout my career, when I've done, I'll give you a little background, but to have 3 hours to talk uninterrupted about parking. Truthfully though, even 40 minutes is a gift. It's a gift. My family thanks you because they're not going to get glazed over with me talking about this constantly when I have an outlet like this. So I really, really appreciate the opportunity. So I got my start in the private sector doing event transportation logistics. So NASCAR, the Olympics in Georgia, tennis and golf tournaments, concerts, things like that. So mass events, a lot of times in the middle of nowhere, no actual parking, big open fields. Go out there and do something with this. Make a parking lot in the transit system. So that's where I got my start. From there I went into government, into parking, so frontline supervision, up through management. I was the director of parking for the City of Beverly Hills, and then I branched out into some more public works things. So both general services and then traditional public works, water, wastewater, utilities, things like that. But parking has always really been my passion. So tonight we're going to dive into the paradox of parking. We're going to start with the concept of the paper domain and the tangible world. So parking exists in these two worlds, especially with cities and government agencies. So when we talk about the paper domain, we talk about the planning aspect of parking. So this is where we regulate parking, this is where we plan for parking, this is where we do the accounting for parking, how many spaces for this thing or that thing, and it exists in a paper world until we build it. And then it becomes the tangible world, where we operate it, where we maintain it, where we have to have the functional pieces that come together. Now in an ideal world, those things work together. But a lot of times we've created things, covenants and loop parking, that only live on paper. They have a purpose, and I'm not suggesting they don't, and we want them to work in construct and consort with what we're doing, but that doesn't always happen. And over years and years and years, we sometimes see how these things start to create some conflicts in the world. Whether it's funding or whether it's, we have something on paper that says parking exists, when you go out there, the business actually doesn't have access to that parking. So it exists on a piece of paper, but it doesn't actually exist in the fundamental world. And so we'll talk kind of all through today about some options and about some other things that happen. When we talk about options, I just want to be clear, it's not really SLO specific, it's not specific to Stanley Obispo, but it's kind of what's going on out in the world a little bit and what others have done. And in some cases, maybe some crazy thoughts that I've had, and you may look at it and say, where did these people come from? And send them back there. So just to give a framework, parking in a world started out where it was very underestimated. So we didn't really think about the operating side of parking. It grew up very much in a policy perspective. And then the management of parking kind of just happened out in the world. And cities grew up with it, and a lot of times you saw in cities very capable people, but people without a background in the industry would come in to manage it, and it kind of got fumbled around with. And it became a profession over the years, and then we started to see it become a value. And it became the bookends of a community experience. It's the first and last thing that people experience when they come to a community. Now, interestingly, that dynamic is changing in the mobility world. Even at the industry level, the International Parking Institute became the International Parking Mobility Institute. The California Public Parking Association became the California Mobility and Parking Association. And when I started, CPPA was the original name, and if you Googled it, it came up the California Potbelly Pig Association. From the world of Google, that tells you where parking was. It changed things. It came after Potbelly Pig. So there's that underestimating the value of the parking piece right from the internet. So then we got to a place where we started overestimating the value of parking a little bit. The concept being, it became a center point of our focus instead of the community and the things that we're serving. People aren't coming to park. People are coming to experience whatever they're here to do, and parking is in between that. So if you built a parking lot out in the middle of the desert, I mean, maybe the novelty of it, people would go see it, but nobody's showing up because you built a parking lot. So when we talk about parking as a community experience, it's serving a purpose. It's an intermediary, whether it's like transit or something else, it's serving a purpose to get you there. So be careful not to overestimate what parking is going to drive. There's places that have no parking that are, incredibly hard, and people still go there because they love the experience. Yogi Berra has to say, that place is so crowded nobody goes there anymore. Right? So that kind of concept that people will find a way if they want the experience. So yes, it's important, but don't overestimate the value of it or get tied up in it too much. And it's very emotional. Parking is very personal. It's a competition for resources, right? It's something we all do, so we all experience, we all have an opinion on it, we all feel like we have a better way to do it. It becomes a very personal experience. And, Katie and I here were talking about changing our meters to credit card meters, and before we did that, we actually explored, much like the pay stations you have here, we explored that. And in our particular community, and I'm not joking, people have this one-on-one relationship with their meter. And when we talked about a multi-space meter, people just lost their minds. And so, like, two times we tried to put it in that community, and it's failed. And people talk about like 2007 like it was yesterday. And I often say, like, think about what your phone looked like in 2007. We're not talking about the same technology, but never. It's just a verboten thing to talk about. So it's very, very emotional experience. And then the second piece, when you look at it from the business side, businesses have this experience because they often don't have control of the parking. So it's the landlord, or it's the city, or it's some other outside agency that has an effect on the way they do business and the way they can that business. And a lot of times it's unknown how much of an effect it can have. So is it that I can't find parking, or is it a rate sensitivity, is it a distance thing? So there's this anxiety that comes from not having control of something that we value as part of our business model. So it creates an emotional experience. And with that emotional experience, what I would tell you is channel that into a focus on outcomes. So try not to get hung up on the input. So whether it's the type of technology, or I like to use free parking as an example of this because it's such a divisive topic often, but we get stuck on the topic of free parking. We don't realize that it's an input. We're not trying to give away free parking for the purpose of giving away free parking. We're trying to achieve something by doing that. If you start defining what it is you're trying to achieve by giving free parking, so whether that's promoting the community or drawing people out on a time or night that they don't normally come out, or it's promotional, or it's ease of convenience, whatever you're trying to get at with free parking, if you have that discussion, free parking can be a part of it. But if you talk about free parking as an input, you're stuck on there's only one way to do that, and that's giving parking for free. There's not a lot of discussion about how to achieve the outcome. It's really an input, and it gets often talked about as an outcome. So I would encourage you to really think about it in that way. Is focus on your outcomes and try and get over that emotional hurdle. And we all have. I have it too. Trust me. I do. So development standards and parking. So I have a lot of sympathy for cities in this place because they're trying to achieve something with this, right? And so you have a lot of competing outcomes right from the get-go. So you have not only the business and the residential community that may be having issues with how parking is affecting them differently, or how it's affecting the visitor, how it's affecting the business. But parking may also be competing on levels of affordable housing. How is it affecting the development? How is it affecting sustainability? How is it affecting climate goals? How is it affecting all these other goals you have in the city? And a lot of times, this just becomes a choice. There's no magic bullet or single answer. You're choosing between competing outcomes that you're trying to achieve, and these things may be they may not, and you can try and find places that they're not, but oftentimes, if you're promoting people to come in a car or you're catering to them, it's almost like enabling them. And we're going to talk a little bit how some universities are actually dealing with that in the post-COVID world. They had some realizations of the COVID world, so they changed the way they look at that. Then there's the issue of local control. Constantly pressure on cities from state and other agencies that's eroding local control. And that's challenging because there's a lot of things that fundamentally we can do as groups or you can study, but there's a lot of tinkering you have to do to get it right for your community. When you see these things come into the state level, they may be great for overarching goals, but they may be a lot of difficult things for local communities to handle. One of the other pieces of local control is almost every development has some kind of parking or traffic impact. And that oftentimes gives cities an opportunity to have some discretionary process in the actual development process. And so sometimes when you talk about parking concessions as a part of the development process, you get other things out of it. You can get public art out of it. You can get public green spaces out of it. You can get other public benefits in that discretionary process. And so when you give up that, you lose a little bit of that local control, and you lose a bit of that negotiating piece. And in some cases, you may be losing an entry point into some of the other things you want to achieve as part of that negotiation process. Long-term quality of life, so we talk about the experience that residents may have in neighboring areas, or the visitor that may be coming to you. You're trying to balance this with policies today that are going to be 20 or 30 years as a development exists in the community, and as you're doing infill and refill. So these things kind of lag on, and they exist in the world. Even when we change them, the things that we did today may be there forever, right? There's a council member that talks about, that I work with, that used to talk about every system, or every outcome that you have, you created the perfect system to get there. Whether you intended to or not, you created the perfect system to do that. So when you look at those inputs again and those outputs, that policy piece, really for the long-term piece, that can affect what you're doing today, 25 years from now. And you're seeing that in bigger cities that, I don't think it's any secret, we'll talk about it, have potentially overbuilt parking. And so that's affecting long-term quality of life in a different way than they thought when they were requiring, and then they were asking for it. And the last one is precision without accuracy. This is a Don Shute, one of Don Shute's tenants. If you know or don't know Don Shute, he wrote the book, The High Cost of Free Parking. And he talks all about this concept of, in the construction world, we say, you design it to the micrometer, you measure it with a tape measure, you mark it with a felt tip pen, and then you saw it with a handsaw. So, the same kind of concept in the parking world. And then the planning side of things, we have this precision, but when we get out into the world, it doesn't necessarily translate into accuracy. And so a lot of technology and a lot of concepts in terms of metrics now are looking at the supply side and the demand side of parking as opposed to what we think it will do based on something we saw happen somewhere else that may or may not be accurate. What's happening actually today here? We'll talk a little bit about that. Parking is a placemaker, right? So parking is a necessary piece of a community. And so these are ways that you've seen other communities weave them into the experience. So in the middle there, you actually have Rodeo Drive. And that building is actually a parking structure. It's meant to look like part of the architecture of Rodeo Drive. And in fact, it actually had a driveway that entered on Rodeo Drive. And it was so disruptive to the pedestrian experience, they moved that to the side street. So they after construction, they actually turned that. So that driveway now has a hairpin turn to get into that structure. It's not super awesome, but it created a very, a much better pedestrian experience on Rodeo Drive. Again, that's the attraction. So let the parking be secondary to that, and let's focus on the attraction. I'm not going to lie to you, there's a ton of money in it for the city with leasing front space on Rodeo Drive, so it kind of blunted the pain to do that, because frontage space on Rodeo Drive gets a very nice rate. So it was a catalyst to do that. On the other side there, you have the City of Santa Monica. That's their Civic Center lot. So they wanted to be bold, and they wanted to be an architectural piece, lighting, color. They wanted to create something that stood out in the community. At the bottom there, you actually have Kansas City, the library. That's the bridging experience, right? So I actually start my experience, I don't know if you can see, it's a little tough, but those are book spines as part of the facade of the structure. So as you actually, you're starting your experience at the Kansas City Library as you drive by it before you even get into the parking lot, before you go to the Civic Center. If you came on a bus, if you came on a bike, you're experiencing this as a piece of the architecture and a piece of the community that's tied to what you're actually doing. And then this is the City of Hope here on the other side. These two pictures are actually the same garage. It's a little hard to see in the picture, but that facade there creates this lighting experience in the garage. The way the light casts into the garage, but they actually looked at it as a piece of almost art as part of the parking experience, the way the light casts. I laughed at this a little bit, but we designed a bathroom in Beverly Hills in the park, and we actually did the same thing. There's this beautiful sunset thing that happens in the bathroom, so if you go to the bathroom at sunset, you get this incredible experience on the floor of the bathroom in one of the parks. So anything can be a placemaker, whether it's a restroom in a park or it's a parking garage. It's about tying those community things together. And a lot of those things can be retrofitted. I mean, some of them you need to build, but a lot of those things can be done after the fact. So at the top there, oh God, it's escaping me where that was. But then you can see where they had the plain facade, and they turned that into a mural there. The bottom of South Dakota, they created that walkway. It's the actual same space, but they created a walkable space as part of the transit center, which actually you see increased usage of. So people aren't trying to avoid this middle space here. They're actually participating in that space that created the bridge from one modality to the next. So how do I get there? It's an inviting experience as opposed to I'm begrudgingly walking through the scoreboard and it's sticky and I don't like it and I don't want to be there. It's not lit well. I mean, maybe it wasn't sticky, but when I look at it, I feel like it's sticky. What would it look like if you took a parking lot that was underutilized and you converted it to office or housing? What could we do with parking that exists today that's not necessarily ready to be torn down? But I think the takeaway from the conceptual design here is that they're looking at parking as a spare resource now, right? It's surplus. What are we going to do with it? We need to find other things to do with it. And I think you're going to see a little bit of that in larger cities that have built a ton of parking. I think Plus, which is one of the biggest parking operators in the world, I think their last count was something like, there's 7 parking spaces for every registered vehicle in the United States. So that means when every car is parked, there's 6 empty parking spaces to serve that vehicle, right? Not the best use of time, money, and space, right? So people are looking for other things to do with it. Which brings us to the changing environment of demand. Demand has shifted over time, both in place and in type. So when I first got started in the industry, both in the planning and in the tangible world, we used to talk about parking in a retail to restaurant conversion. So people came to shop, and then they would grab something to eat, or they would meet people after, but the driver that we talked about in terms of serving was retail, and then it was restaurant. And then as Amazon came on and we started to see the online marketplace and we started to see the delivery process, that started to shift from restaurant to retail. Meaning the draw was now people going to have a meal, going out to be social, and then they would walk around in order to shop because they were present. And this is another tenet of Don Shoup's, and I'll touch on it later, but it's this idea that each one of these individual things that we're trying to go to has its own parking. That means, they're going to be protective of it. So I have to keep moving my car as I do the next thing. I go to the salon, or I go to buy something, then I go have lunch, then we're going to grab a coffee or dessert somewhere else. And if each one of those things has its own parking experience, we get to a place where I'm actually transporting my car, and my car isn't transporting me. I'm dragging it along with me as I go down my list of things to do, because I have to move it, because that's what the song says. And so it's this antithetical park once kind of concept if we look at parking individually. COVID and the curbside. So COVID dramatically changed the curbside overnight. Whether it was delivery or it was creating spaces and parklets for dining. I've seen salons doing haircuts in them. I've seen everything. And interestingly, this is one of those places where we get back to that conversation of the tangible and the paper world. And look, I don't mean this as a slight against cities, but I think the first reaction cities had to this, because it was so dramatic, was, la, 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 la. We know you're not supposed to do that, but there's nothing else to be done, right? We're in an emergency, right? So when you look at parking in that world, it's like going to the emergency room. We're just going to have to figure it out. And then on Sneaky News, I actually was part of a council meeting last night, where they're just talking about, 3-4 years later, about how to make some of those rules permanent. What does that really look like? And I would say it's not because of inefficiency. I would say governments are built for transparency and participation. They're not necessarily built for efficiency. So in order to do all that process, it can take 2 or 3 years for that stuff to shake out. But it's that concept that the tangible world figured something out first. And now we have to figure it out on paper to catch up to it. And while that's happening, the tangible world is changing again, right? And so, sometimes you can anticipate it. Sometimes you really just have to catch up. You just have to catch up. And so it's part of the choices you have to make. And if we look forward, I would say it's the autonomous vehicle in anticipation. So what is autonomous vehicles? What does that look like at the curbside or the garage? How does it change the use? And you see the big parking operators. These are publicly traded companies talking about this, the concept of how to use parking garages in the autonomous world. They're still going to need a place to charge. They're going to need a place to be stored. They're going to need a place to wait if they're moving around. They're going to need a place to be maintained and clean. There's still an environment there that those have to operate in. And so the second piece of that is the curbside. If people are picking up and dropping off, suddenly you really need curb space available, or you're really creating traffic congestion. Right? You're creating traffic congestion because there's not a place for that autonomous vehicle to go or pick you up or drop you off. Where you get into the next level of the world, and it's going to pick up your groceries or your meal for you, and somebody's putting it in the car, and you're not even there. You're not even part of the transaction. I don't even really want to get into drones, but you're seeing this in other countries and other spaces where drones are actually going to potentially compete for some piece of space somewhere. So is that a rooftop? Is that a sidewalk? Is that what is it? I don't have the answer, but you're seeing that competition start to come out. Which is driving this change at the garage level, right? Parking is a mobility problem. So you're seeing the publicly traded companies start talking about what do we do with these garages now if the same kind of demand doesn't exist? And so, real quick, I just want to touch on one of the fundamental issues of parking as a revenue source. So when we talk about a tangible item, the parking itself, the garage being a tangible space, falls into the little bit of an intangible product, right? So if I don't sell a product on my shelf in my store today, I might be able to sell it tomorrow. If I don't sell that parking space today, I never get a chance to sell an empty parking space yesterday. It's gone. That opportunity's gone. That revenue stream is gone. That source is gone. So these publicly traded companies, these large operators, are looking for a way to maximize those spaces. So electrification is a big one because they want to draw those folks in and they want to provide that. But it's also kind of this weird push and pull where if they put too many and they remain open, then they can't sell that space to somebody else. But if they don't put enough, then they're not meeting the customer needs. So they're really dealing with that. One of the pictures you see here is contactless charging. So, it's not quite there yet, but the idea that you can have infrastructure in much, much more of an area, and again, an autonomous vehicle could just pull it, they don't have to do anything. It's touchless. So they're looking to the future to say, how do we create these spaces? How do I change modalities? I get to a parking structure. In fact, I think SLO is actually great for this. At the hotel I'm staying at, they give you a bicycle. And I think that's kind of a common thing here. So I park my car, I drive into town, I park my car from where I came from. And I actually never have to move my car to get around down. Either I walk or I grab a bicycle. And we were talking earlier, an electric bike for me would probably be better. And I break a sweat, I don't have 2 stairs, that's real. So the advent of technology and these types of things are changing the dynamic of how we experience those modality changes. So we used to talk about that historically. Every time you had a change, you would drop off your customer. So I had to get a bus, I had to take a transfer, I had to do this. There's still an element of that. But the idea is it's moving a lot quicker. Talk about electrification. We're going to talk a little bit in detail about microtransit, but you're seeing this come out as on-demand. It's almost like an Uber, a cross between Uber and NASCAR. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail. This is also something people told me about the bike kitchen in SLO. People told me about the bike kitchen in SLO. So you're seeing bicycle. The picture there is Boise, Idaho. They had this kind of empty space in the middle of the entry to the parking lot where the entry and exit lanes were. And they created this entire bike. The picture's a little small, but it's like this open, round, bikes in the round, and you have maintenance in there and storage, and it's just kind of a great experience. All right, so microtransit. So it has a couple components to it. So it's generally technology-based, so it's app-driven. It's now being combined, so it functions a little bit like Uber. In some cases, it's on demand. In some cases, it's reservations. It's usually between $1 and $2 for a trip. It's usually district-based. So you take transit where you drive to an area, and then within that area, you can actually get microtransit either at pre-set-up stops that are in areas, or some of them do door-to-door. In some cases, they actually will take you from wherever you're standing to wherever you want to go. Some have you waiting 15 minutes, some have you waiting 30 minutes, some can have you program it and ask for that in advance. So it's changing, Uber changed the way we thought about parking demand when it came on. So parking as shared rides, that's existed since the horse development, right? To pay somebody else to pay for something. That's nothing new. And then we had taxis, right? But then Uber came on the scene. I mean, you look at this from a parking demand perspective, Uber dramatically changed major events, airports, hotels in Las Vegas. You have these huge parking lots. And suddenly entire floors of those parking lots are dedicated to share ride, right? I mean, taxis existed long before that happened. But when people put it in your hand and they changed that experience with Uber, it dramatically changed it. Hotels, you and I were talking about this earlier too. In Beverly Hills, where the Golden Globes were, they actually had, that hotel has a huge parking lot that was busy 3, 4, 5 nights a week, full. You couldn't even find a spot. When Uber became a big part of that model, they couldn't fill up 3 levels of that garage. It was half empty. I mean, it changed overnight. So when they were looking at expanding their ballroom, or they're coming to the city and we're having this talk and they're saying, what do you mean I have to add parking? I've got more parking than I know what to do with in this place, but the paper side of that world hadn't caught up to what Uber was doing and its effect. And that effect may not be on everything, but when you look at it from the perspective of those major events or airports or those singularities, in a lot of ways, it had a very different effect on their parking than it might have on the smaller parking. And then the last piece of this is there was one that was a public-private partnership. They charged a little bit more, and they actually sought sponsorship from businesses to actually put stops in front of their area or on their lot. So that was a model that looked a little bit different from the subsidy perspective. It was a public-private partnership. All right, parking in the news. So this comes back to that concept of so the two universities here highlighted are UC Davis and OHSU. During COVID, they experienced massive losses in their parking revenues because everything went remote, so people weren't coming. And in the university environment, they were building tons and tons of parking for these, both employees, students. OHSU is a health system, so it's a patient-driven system as well. A little bit different. So OHSU is actually employee-focused. And their parking became wage-based. So they have wages between it's like $45,000, 7 brackets of wages, $45,000 a year up to $180,000 a year. And you pay your daily parking. They don't offer monthly parking. You pay for what you use. They don't want to enable you to park on a day you don't need it. They want you to need to drive that day. And so that ranges from 7 brackets and it almost doubles. So if you're at the bottom of the bracket, you're paying somewhere like $5 or $6, and if you're at the top of the bracket, you can be paying anywhere from $12 to $18 for the same parking space. So they are using that, and then they're encouraging people through their other modes of transportation. So whether it's free parking ride lots, whether it's share rides, whether it's bicycles, they're giving you that for free. They're subsidizing that and they're paying for that with the parking fees. But they're doing that on a wage-based system for their employees. So that's very employee-focused. On the flip side, you have UC Davis. It's student-focused. And they did away with all parking passes that were either by semester or by month. So they basically said, if you need to drive, you need to pay for that day. And then they created a bunch of other opportunities. So whether it was shuttle buses or it was, the concept being, they don't want to charge you for a month of parking, and then when you're saying, well, I could ride my bike, or I could, but I've already paid for it. The parking's paid whether I use it or not. So I'm going to drive it. It makes it very easy to do. It's not changing the way we think about how we get from place to place. So they're trying to do that. They're doing with that rates and with incentives. So we'll talk a little bit about that, the concept of rewarding people for not parking, right? So when we talk about that, we're doing that. Car parking is a struggling industry. I touched on some of that. SP Plus was interviewed by CNBC. We talked all about how we're trying to find revenue sources that are not parking-based, so they're trying to be technology-based, service-based, because there's too much of it. One of the things you see in AI right now is dynamic pricing engines that are competing with each other to get the right rate for parking, like in that minute. So you go on an app, and it's really priced to the minute based on who's buying parking. You know, there was a joke in the event business when we charge for parking is we never have a full sign, right? All we had is different rate signs. The fuller the lot got, the more expensive the lot got. But we're never going to park that last space. Because if the 2 cars before it came in and we charged them $40, we're going to try and ask $60 for the next person and $100 for the next person. If we get it, great. We're not putting the full sign in. We're going to sell that last space for what it's worth. Right? So a very different way of thinking about space. And now, those companies are actually they're driving the price down to attract you in a market that's oversaturated with parking. We're trying to do that with artificial intelligence in the moment, right in that minute that you're on the app trying to do that. And then the bottom is examples of, again, these are real examples of reuse that occurred. I apologize it's so small, but Chicago converted a parking lot into an e-commerce delivery center, so like an Amazon fulfillment center kind of thing. LA started doing food delivery services in kitchens in an empty space. Rooftops in Seattle started to be urban farms. And in Paris, they actually started to do mushrooms in underground facilities where they didn't need light to grow. So roots and things like that. I always thought, I kind of thought this was a missed opportunity in COVID to take an underground parking structure and kind of turn it into a paintball thing. I think that would be kind of like a cool, urban experience with paintball in the dark parking garage. But the concept is these companies, both private and the operators, are looking for things to do other than parking. So while it may not translate directly to your community, the concept is out in the world. They're starting to look at what do we do with these parking lots that we have that we can't fill. And it goes back to that revenue piece, right? I can't sell that empty space yesterday. So parking policies and resources. So one of the things I was asked to speak about was this concept of parking minimums. Strong Towns and the Parking Reform Network has one of the best sort of pieces of information about who's doing what with that. And these are publicly accessible. I kind of threw all this stuff into a worksheet. And I'm happy to show this to anybody who wants it, but they have a download on there, but it's kind of hard to look at. So I threw that in a spreadsheet and tried to do some work with it. So you have, normally I wouldn't read the slide, but I think it's a little bit small. There's 637 agencies across the country with populations from 300 to 8.5 million, not counting the states. So California shows up on there at 39 million because of the AB 2097, the latest agenda bill that affected parking and transportation corridors in California. But strictly cities, it's 307 to 8.3 million. Interestingly, the leaders, you kind of see just the density in the Midwest. The Midwest is really taking to this. The leaders, Illinois, Iowa, and Wisconsin, in terms of cities, and that translates. So I filtered it down to cities between 45 and 70,000 to give kind of a perspective for a place like San Luis Obispo. What does that look like in a potentially population-related area? There's probably 1,000 of those to measure, but same leaders, right? Same leaders, Illinois, Iowa, and Wisconsin in that population range. Most of them are going to no parking minimums. A handful of them are creating parking maximums. You can't build any more than this much parking. We don't want you to use land for that. And most of them are eliminating it in city centers and special districts. So a few are doing it citywide, but most of them are doing it in specific areas. And I think from a downtown perspective, I'm guessing, but I think it has to do with how much parking is built over time, right? And the idea of creating downtowns with centralized parking. That's where you see some of the maxims. Artificial intelligence. I went on ChatGPT and I asked it, what would happen if San Luis Obispo removed parking? It's a fairly generic answer, but this is what we hear, right? It's going to increase development. It's going to get to our housing, affordable housing. So incentivizing, we talked about commercial space too. More walkable and bikeable communities, livability, quality of life. The next two are a little bit of, these are things that brought up as concerns. And I'll talk a little bit about them. So it said you're going to have increased traffic congestion, circulation while looking for parking. So I will be submitting something to them about this. Because I feel there's two pieces that this, not that it isn't true or possible, but I think it misses the point when we talk about parking minimums in general. Which is one, it assumes that there's not enough parking already, so people are going to have to drive around and look for it. Two, it's assuming that the parking minimum is the reason they're driving around looking for it, not because they don't know where it exists, or signage, or guidance, or space monitoring, or all the other technologies that exist to get people to where that is. Is that really tied to parking minimums? It could be, but it may not be. There's an interesting story about UCLA. It's like 15, 20 years ago. UCLA spent $1 million on a software system to monitor parking spaces and guidance so that they could sell the booth at the right place. And in those days, they spent $1 million on a software system. It's kind of unheard of. And what UCLA came back and said is, look, we parked 300 more cars a day than we did before we put that system in. So when we talk about this in terms of an expense, if I had to build a 300 space parking garage, that would have cost us $15 million. Not including the land, and I would have had to find the land to do it, and I couldn't do something else with the land if I did. So to spend $1 million on a system that got me 300 more cars parked, just by guidance and monitoring, we think we got a steal, right? And it turned the industry a little bit on its ear. And literally, you'd sit in the dark, smoky rooms with whiskey and cigarettes for parking people, and talk about spending $1 million. And people were blown away by it. But you know, as you look at it from that perspective, truly, they were much more progressive thinking than the rest of us. And the last thing, and I think this is the most interesting to me, is artificial intelligence is telling us parking is emotional. One of the concerns is residents are going to worry. Not that they're not going to have parking, but they're going to worry about the parking for their vehicles and their taxis. I mean, artificial intelligence is telling us this is an emotional response. So I found that incredibly interesting. I'm looking around maybe some of you don't mind, which is incredibly interesting. But hey, that's why I love parking. All right, so that gets us kind of to the heart of it. Transitional, conventional, and bleeding edge thoughts on the planning side. Again, not suggesting this for SLO, but suggesting this for, you know, here's some things to think about differently, potentially. Some of these you might already be doing. Truthfully, it's a pretty bold community in a lot of ways, and cutting edge in a lot of ways in some of the things you do. So if I say something you're already doing, don't take that just because I didn't know. But, okay, so real-time parking supply and demand. So West Hollywood's actually a community that does this, where they actually look at the real-time availability of parking when a development comes and makes their application and says, well, if you need 100 spaces and there's 75 already in our model, you don't need to build it. And then they go and measure that again, because just because we said you need 75 on paper doesn't mean you may actually take 75 up in the model. Something else may change. So they're constantly looking at the supply and demand. Parking variance at the business level and not the land level. So we tend to think about parking running with the land. It's driven by the business, but it tends to stick with the land. So the idea of thinking about it in terms of the actual business and it going away, so if you're worried about it in this transitional way, allow it to function with the business. If the business goes away, then you don't have to continue to deal with the land. The second piece is that allows you to actually promote types of businesses that you may or may not want. I mean, you have to work that through your process, but I was actually watching a rate hearing the other day that had to do with sidewalk dining, and they were pricing sidewalk dining based on the streets that they wanted to see more of it. And they were also pricing it, and in a lot of ways with this actually had to do with the parking minimums, not being able to regulate it, but being given opportunities if they put the dining in the front on the street as opposed to in the back of the restaurant. They were using that to promote the vibrance on the street. So ways to encourage the types of uses that you want to look at. In lieu is an operating expense, so the concept of allowing in lieu almost to be like a lease at the business level instead of being a capital expense as you're trying to open your business or as a landlord. That can be a tremendous drain. Banks don't want to finance it. It can be incredibly problematic. I'm not talking about amortization. So I'm not saying you owe it either way and let's pay it off monthly. I'm saying charge it like we charge rent or lease. And you can figure out what number works. But it's a different way of looking at the concept. And the last one in that idea is the concept of credits for the things that are driving people to not use their car. So a lot of that is transitional in nature. So whether it's LEED, ParkSmart is the version of LEED for parking garages. Most garages aren't capable of achieving a LEED standard, so there's a ParkSmart standard for parking garages. And then that concept of microtransit. How am I getting people to a garage or to a central place, and then using some other form of transit? In the operational world, that concept of daily pricing, let people pay for what they're actually using, and let's reward them for not using it. So there's a major technology company that explored this. They didn't actually do it because they didn't have political will to in the Bay Area, but they were actually exploring ways to pay people for not parking, knowing that on certain days they needed to park. So they were giving them credits. For every day you don't park, you get a parking credit. And when you get 10 of those, you can park for free that day. Because we know someday you're going to need to do it. So they're incentivizing not parking, and then allowing you to use, sort of bank that not parking to use on that day. When we talk about that idea of 10 cars or 7 cars, how many of those do you need before you suddenly free up space in a garage and you don't need to build another? So even from that perspective, it's potentially valuable. Microtransit, the autonomous shuttles, subsidization here. People get really squishy about that idea of subsidizing that, but I would challenge that again with the idea of what does it cost to build a garage? If I cannot build a garage by funding microtransit, it's going to cost me a lot less. Just on a $15 million garage, I want to say it's like $500,000 a year in debt service, and that's not counting the revenue generated. But nobody actually ever counts the cost of generating the revenue. So generating $500,000 would cost me to maintain it and rebuild. So the idea that I could potentially do that for 5 or 10 years, or 20 or 30 years, if you're charging some piece, what's the landscape going to look like for parking if I can avoid building parking lots there by subsidizing something in the transition period? Paid parking in residential neighborhoods, this is usually where people throw me out of the room. But the reality is, rates drive behavior. They may not make you come or make you leave, but they can very much drive where you're going to go. And the fact is, when we have free parking in residential neighborhoods, price-sensitive customers, we're engineering them to go to that place, and then we're trying to combat it with permits and regulations and restrictions and enforcement. We create a cat and mouse game, and they move to the next street. The fact is, if we charge them and we charge them too much, they probably don't want to park there. And if they do, you're generating revenue off something that it didn't really cost you anything to build. And again, this is very much in a world where technology exists that you don't have to have meters to do this anymore. You literally do this with a QR code and a sign. And you can enforce it with license plate recognition. So technology has allowed us to explore something that would have been invasive in a residential neighborhood that isn't as much as it was in the past. And the last one is truly the idea of parking maintenance, use, and benefit histories. So I'm doing this very much in the extreme level, and I liken this to shopping malls. Shopping malls build the cost of parking into both their leases and their CAM, the common area maintenance charges. So functionally, they provide you all the parking, but they're charging you for that parking in a way to make it cost effective for them. It's getting borne by the businesses that are part of that mall. And I think, again, one of the most interesting pieces of that is malls are trying to design themselves now to look like cities, to look like downtowns. And they're giving their businesses the benefit of a parking district by creating that, billing for it, charging for it, or having this sort of in a collective way. So if you think about it from a city perspective, there's ways to create districts in the city that have that same benefit as a mall. And so this is all of those things on one slide. I'm kind of done. I think my time is up. I might run a little over. I'm perfect.